On the night of November 11, 1692, in a small meeting house in northern Essex County, Massachusetts, a Puritan minister delivered a sermon so terrifying that 3 members of his congregation were dead before sunrise. The sermon's manuscript was bound in plain calfskin, locked in an iron box beneath the pulpit, and buried in the meeting house foundation when the building was torn down in 1784. For nearly 150 years, the villagers who knew the story refused to speak of it above a whisper. They called it simply the Night Discourse, and they believed that anyone who read the minister's words aloud would not live to see the next dawn. What follows is the full account of that sermon, the man who wrote it, and the 7 deaths that no court in Massachusetts ever dared to investigate. Before we continue with the story of Reverend Josiah Harkwell and the village of Wrentham Crossing, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. It helps more than you know. Now, let us return to the autumn of 1692 and to a corner of the Bay Colony where the Salem witch trials were only the beginning of the horror. Wrentham Crossing was a small settlement, even by frontier standards. It sat in a shallow valley about 11 miles inland, between the Merrimack River and the wooded uplands rising toward New Hampshire. Fewer than 90 families lived there in the autumn of 1692, mostly Congregationalists who had arrived in the second wave of Puritan migration some 30 years earlier. The village was known for 3 things: excellent hard cider from a large orchard planted by its founder, Ebenezer Treadway, one of the oldest meeting houses in the northern colony, built of hand, hewn oak and dark fieldstone, and, according to the magistrates in Ipswich, a reputation as one of the quietest, most orderly settlements in the region. No fights, no drunkenness, no open disputes. The village governed itself through a committee of 7 elders, men of middling wealth and strict religious observance. And for the previous 23 years, the pulpit had been occupied by a single minister, Reverend Josiah Harkwell. Harkwell was 58 years old in the autumn of the trials. He had come to Wrentham Crossing as a young man from Boston, where he had studied under Reverend Increase Mather. His congregation regarded him as a man of deep learning, severe temperament, and unshakable faith. Tall and thin, with gray hair pulled back into a tight queue, he preached with a quiet intensity that never rose to theatrical fury. The villagers respected him, but few loved him. He had never married. He lived alone in the small parsonage behind the meeting house with a single housekeeper, a widow named Prudence Doiver, who had kept his house for over a decade. Harkwell's sermons were copied each week by one of the elders and bound into leather volumes stored in the parsonage cellar. By 1692, nearly 200 of these sermons had been preserved. Every one of them had been preached, except the last. To understand the events of that November, one must first understand the atmosphere that hung over all of New England that year. The summer of 1692 had been unusually hot. Spring rains had failed. The corn was thin, the apple harvest late. A measles outbreak had carried off 11 children in the nearby town of Rowley. The Penobscot and Abenaki, harried by northern wars and ongoing conflict with New France, had been raiding frontier settlements in Maine with greater boldness than in living memory. Refugees drifted southward through the Bay Colony, bringing stories of burned villages and captives carried off into the woods. Sermons in surrounding towns took up the same themes: hidden sin, unseen judgment, and the thinness of the curtain between the visible world and what was called the invisible. It was a season when people listened to the sound of their own houses settling at night with the alertness of prey. And in Salem village, less than 20 miles south, the witch trials had been raging since the previous winter. By October, 19 people had been hanged on Gallows Hill. One old man, Giles Corey, had been pressed to death beneath a stack of stones for refusing to enter a plea. More than 150 accused souls sat in jails at Ipswich, Cambridge, and Boston, awaiting trials that might never come. The hysteria had spread outward from Salem in concentric rings of suspicion. Even in quiet Wrentham Crossing, neighbors who had known one another for decades began to watch one another with new and uneasy eyes. Women who had always lived alone became subjects of gossip. Old quarrels over fence lines took on the character of spiritual warfare. Children who had once played freely in the commons were kept indoors by their parents. And every cow that sickened, every cream that failed to butter, every headache that lasted more than a day was quietly examined for the marks of the adversary. The first sign that something was wrong came in the last week of September. A young woman named Abigail Rudd, 19 years old, recently married to the blacksmith's son, began to suffer what her mother described as fits of the falling sickness. She would collapse without warning, her body rigid, her eyes rolled back, her mouth foaming. When she recovered, she remembered nothing. The village physician, Dr. Hiram Whetfield, could find no physical cause. Within 10 days, 4 other young women in the village were suffering the same affliction. Hannah Codall, the miller's daughter; Sarah Brimby, a servant in Elder Penhale's household; Rebecca Dow, a 23-year-old widow living with her mother-in-law; and Mary Treadway, a great-granddaughter of the village's founder. The elders met in secret and agreed to handle the matter quietly, without summoning the magistrates from Ipswich. None of them wished to bring the Salem madness down upon their own heads. They had seen what happened to villages that called in the magistrates. They had watched Andover fall apart in the span of a summer. They had no desire to be next. Reverend Harkwell was asked to visit each of the afflicted women and pray over them. He did so, and reported to the elders that he had found no evidence of diabolical possession. He suggested the fits were the result of poor diet, bad air, and the general disturbance of the times. The elders accepted his judgment with relief, but Harkwell himself did not accept it. In his private journal, a single fragment of which survives in the archives of the Essex Historical Society, he wrote that on the evening of October 29th, he had seen something in the woods behind the parsonage that he could not explain. It had filled him with a cold and growing dread. He had been walking along the path behind the orchard at dusk, when he came to the stone wall marking the boundary between village land and the old Treadway woodlot. There, standing among the trees about 40 yards distant, he saw a figure that appeared to be a woman in a dark gray dress, facing away from him, utterly motionless. He called out. The figure did not move. He walked closer, and as he did, he saw that it was not a woman, but a bundle of cloth hung from a low branch, arranged in the rough shape of a human form. When he approached within 10 feet, he realized the cloth bundle had been tied there recently. The knots were fresh, and the fabric still bore the sharp smell of the wool room, as though pulled from a loom only hours before. Pinned to the cloth with a dull iron nail was a folded piece of paper. On the paper, written in a hand he did not recognize, was a list of 7 names. His own name was fourth. The first 3 names were Abigail Rudd, Prudence Doiver, and Mercy Lincomb. Mercy was his housekeeper's 7-year-old granddaughter who lived in the parsonage. The 4th name was Josiah Harkwell. The 5th, 6th, and 7th names were left blank. Harkwell removed the paper, returned to the parsonage, and locked it inside his writing desk. He did not tell the elders. He did not tell Widow Doiver. In his journal, he wrote only that he had seen a sign of the adversary and intended to address the matter from the pulpit on the next Lord's Day. But the next Lord's Day came and went, and he preached his ordinary sermon on Jeremiah. The list remained locked in the desk. Over the following 2 weeks, 2 of the 3 named women fell gravely ill. Abigail Rudd's fits grew worse. Widow Duiver, who had been in perfect health, began to cough blood into her handkerchief in the small hours of the morning. Always between 2 and 3, always in short bursts of 3 or 4 coughs that left her too weak to rise. Little Mercy Lincomb began to speak of dreams in which a tall man without a face stood at the foot of her bed and pointed at her chest. She woke with her small hands clenched so tightly that her fingernails broke the skin of her palms. On the morning of November 10th, 1692, Reverend Harkwell sent word to the 7 elders that he would preach a special sermon the following evening at the midweek service, and that every adult member of the congregation was to attend. He did not tell them the subject. He asked only that they bring candles, for the sermon would be given after sundown. He also asked, in a note that several elders later remembered as strangely urgent, that no one be permitted to remain outside during the sermon. The doors were to be barred from within. Whatever was said inside would be heard only by those who had been called to hear it. The meeting house that night was filled beyond its ordinary capacity. Roughly 140 adults crowded into the pews and the back gallery. The windows had been shuttered against the cold, and the only light came from the tallow candles each congregant had brought and from a single oil lamp burning on the pulpit. A light snow had begun to fall outside, the first of the season, and the wind moved through the gaps in the shingles with a low, intermittent moan that several witnesses later described as sounding almost like a human voice. The smell of the room was familiar. Cold oak and hot tallow, damp wool from coats hung over pew rails. But underneath those familiar smells, there was said to be something else that night. A faint, sickly sweetness that some compared to the smell of an unopened spring house, and others to the smell of rotting apples. No one could find its source. Reverend Harkwell climbed into the pulpit at precisely 1700, carrying a leather-bound manuscript. He looked older than he had looked the week before. His face had grown thin, and his hands trembled when he opened the book. He did not begin with a prayer. He did not begin with a scripture reading. He began by reading out a list of 7 names: Abigail Rudd, Prudence Doiver, Mercy Lincomb, Josiah Harkwell, Silas Rudd, Thomas Penhale, Ebenezer Cattrick. When he finished, he closed the book. In the silence that followed, one of the elders, Silas Rudd, father of the afflicted Abigail, rose to his feet and demanded to know why his own name had been spoken aloud. Harkwell did not answer him. He opened the book again and began to preach. The manuscript of the sermon, recovered more than 2 centuries later, runs to some 14,000 words, divided into 3 long movements. The first movement, titled On the Covenant of Silence, argued that the village had been built upon a sin that had never been confessed. Harkwell reminded the congregation that the land on which the meeting house stood had not been purchased from the Pennacook people, who had lived there for centuries. It had been taken by force during a brief, undocumented skirmish in 1663, in which Ebenezer Treadway and a small party of settlers had killed 11 Pennacook men, women, and children, burned their wigwams, and thrown the bodies into a sinkhole about a mile north of the village. The survivors had been driven into the forest. The sinkhole had been filled with stones and earth, and over it the settlers had planted the great orchard that was now the pride of the village. Every apple pressed into cider in Wrentham Crossing, Harkwell told the congregation, had grown from soil fed by the bones of murdered people. He named the 4 surviving perpetrators of the killing, 2 of whom were the grandfathers of men sitting in the pews that very evening. He described the weather on the day of the skirmish, the sound the wigwams made when they burned, the way a Pennacook mother had stood her ground with a flint blade and been cut down last. He did not know how he knew these details. They had come to him in dreams since October 29th, dreams that were not his own. He said the covenant of silence, kept for 29 years, had begun to break. The afflictions of the young women were not witchcraft. They were not the work of the devil. They were the first stirrings of a judgment long delayed. A judgment not theological but historical, not supernatural but moral. And he said, in a voice that witnesses described as terribly calm, that the judgment would not stop with the women. It would come for all of them. He knew this because he had been given the list. The list had not been placed in the woods by the adversary. It had been placed there by the hand of someone who remembered. He did not know who. But the list could not be unspoken. The names, once read aloud in the presence of the congregation, could not be taken back. The door of the meeting house was barred from within. No one was leaving until he had finished. The second movement, titled On the Voice from the Orchard, described what he had seen and heard in the weeks before the sermon, the figure in the woods, the paper with the 7 names, and something he had not written in his journal, that on 3 separate nights in October, he had been awakened by a voice speaking to him from beneath the floorboards of the parsonage. The voice had not been loud. It was like the voice of a man speaking into a well from some distance above, coming up thin and hollow from below the feet of his bed. The voice spoke in a language he did not recognize, but which he believed, based on accounts of John Eliot among the native peoples, to be a dialect of Eastern Algonquian. The voice said the same short phrase each time, repeating it slowly 3 times on each of the 3 nights, then falling silent. On the 3rd night, Harkwell had knelt on the floor of his bedroom and written the phrase down phonetically. He read it aloud to the congregation. Several witnesses later agreed on its approximate sound, recorded by Elder Thomas Penhale as Kitahando Nipu Espenumuk. Harkwell had sent a letter inquiring about the phrase to a man in Natick who knew the native tongues. A half-converted Nipmuc elder named Joseph Quannapohit, who had served as a scout for the English during King Philip's War. Quannapohit wrote back briefly. He refused to translate the phrase. He warned Harkwell to burn the paper, to speak the words to no one, and to make no further inquiry. His letter closed with a single line, "Some debts do not grow smaller with time. Put your house in order." Harkwell had not burned the paper. He had instead spoken the words to the congregation that night. He believed now that the voice beneath the floorboards was the voice of a Pennacook powwow, a medicine man, who had been buried alive during the killing of 1663, and whose bones lay somewhere beneath the parsonage foundation. Several members of the congregation began to weep. Others cried out in protest. Elder Caleb Marwell called out for the minister to stop, to come down from the pulpit, to cease before he did greater damage. Harkwell did not stop. Elder Penhale later testified that when the minister spoke the phrase aloud, every candle in the meeting house guttered simultaneously, as though a wind had passed through the shuttered room. Though no wind could be felt on the skin, the oil lamp on the pulpit dimmed to the color of an old bruise, then slowly returned to its normal brightness. And in the moment of that dimming, the shadows on the walls behind the pulpit did not move in the direction the lamp had shifted. They moved in the other direction. The 3rd movement of the sermon was the shortest, and the one the survivors remembered most clearly because they believed for the rest of their lives that it was the one that had killed the 3 who died before dawn. Harkwell titled it, On the Breaking of the 7. He said he had come to understand that the list of 7 names was not a list of victims. It was a list of those who were required to confess. 4 of the 7 were descendants of the men who had carried out the killing in 1663. The other 3 were the silent accomplices across the generations who had inherited the land, the orchard, the prophets, and the silence. The afflictions of Abigail Rudd, the sickness of Prudence Doiver, the dreams of little Mercy Lincomb, and his own growing dread. These were the first 4 breakings. The other 3 would come tonight. They could not be stopped. They could only be witnessed. He turned to Silas Rudd in the front pew and asked him by name whether he knew what his grandfather Jonas Rudd had done in 1663. Silas Rudd did not answer. His face, witnesses said, had gone the color of unbaked bread. Harkwell turned to Thomas Penhale and asked the same question about his grandfather, Obadiah Penhale. Penhale did not answer. Harkwell turned to Ebenezer Kotrick, the youngest of the elders, and asked what his great-uncle Hezekiah had confessed to the minister on his deathbed in 1679. Kotrick did not answer. Harkwell closed the book. He looked out over the congregation. He said only 4 words: "The debt is due." What happened in the next several minutes was described differently by almost every witness who survived. The most consistent account, assembled from the testimony of 23 congregants gathered in the days afterward by the visiting Reverend Nathaniel Saltonstall of Ipswich, is as follows. The candles began to flicker again, and several went out entirely. Of the roughly 140 candles burning at the start of the sermon, no fewer than 31 had gone out, and the pattern of their extinguishment seemed to form a rough circle around the 3 elders named at the end of the sermon. A low sound, some described it as a hum, others as a distant drumming, filled the room. 2 witnesses said it sounded like something heard through the wall of a neighboring house. One said it sounded like a herd of slow horses walking somewhere underneath the floor. Elder Penhale's wife, sitting directly behind her husband, later said she had felt a cold breath of air pass across the back of her neck, as though a door had been opened and closed behind her, though the door of the meeting house was still barred, and no one stood behind her. The blacksmith, a man named Oded Skidmore, said he had looked down at his own hands and seen the hair on his knuckles standing straight up, the way hair stands up before a lightning strike, though no storm was within miles. Abigail Rudd, who was present in the congregation, rose to her feet and walked forward to the pulpit. She did not speak. She stood before Reverend Harkwell. Her eyes, witnesses said, were clear and calm for the first time in weeks. Then she raised one hand and pointed at her own father, Silas Rudd, in the front pew. Silas Rudd stood up, clutched at his chest, and collapsed. He was dead before anyone could reach him. At almost the same moment, Thomas Penhale let out a strangled cry and fell forward onto his hands and knees. He vomited a quantity of dark blood onto the floorboards, tried to rise and collapsed fully. He too was dead within moments. Ebenezer Kotrick ran from the meeting house. The door had been unbarred by a frightened deacon in the moment of the first death. Kotrick was found the next morning in the orchard, face down in the snow about 30 feet from the old sinkhole. He had not been struck. He had not blood. According to Dr. Weffield's examination, he had simply stopped breathing, in the manner of a man whose body had decided, without consultation with any physical cause, to cease its work. 3 men whose grandfathers and great-uncles had killed the Pennacook in 1663 were all dead before the sun rose on November 12, 1692. The story could have ended there. In a different time, in a different place, it might have become public, investigated by the magistrates at Ipswich, reported to Boston, written about in the Mather family's voluminous records. But the autumn of 1692 was not an ordinary autumn. The witch trials at Salem had just collapsed in scandal. Governor Sir William Phipps had dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer on October 29th, less than 2 weeks before the sermon, because his own wife had been accused, and he had suddenly discovered that the spectral evidence upon which the court had based most of its convictions was worthless. The colony was exhausted, ashamed, and deeply frightened of any new outbreak of supernatural rumor. No one in the higher circles of colonial government had any appetite for the news that 3 prominent men of a quiet village in Essex County had died in a single night during a sermon that named a buried atrocity. So the elders of Wrentham Crossing made a collective decision. They met at dawn on November 12th, while the bodies still lay uncovered in the meeting house, covered only with plain linen cloths. They swore an oath of silence. They agreed that the 3 dead men had suffered natural attacks of apoplexy, brought on by the stress of the season. They agreed that the sermon would be described, if at all, as an ordinary exhortation to repentance. They agreed that the manuscript would be hidden. They agreed that Harkwell's private journal would be destroyed, though in the event, it was only partially destroyed, a single fragment escaping the fire in the parsonage hearth. They agreed that the letter from Joseph Quanapohit would be burned in its entirety, and they agreed that Reverend Josiah Harkwell would be sent away. Harkwell did not resist. He handed over the manuscript to the senior surviving elder, Caleb Marwell, on the condition that it be preserved, not destroyed. Marwell had it bound in a plain calfskin cover, placed inside a small iron box, and locked with a key he alone kept. The box was set into a cavity beneath the pulpit, and the floorboards were replaced over it. Harkwell left Wrentham Crossing on November 17, 1692, carrying only a small wooden chest and a single horse. He did not return to Boston. He did not go to any other settlement in the colony. According to one letter preserved in the Saltonstall family papers, he was seen riding northwest into the woods toward the old Pennacook territories along the Merrimack. He was never seen again by any Englishman in the Bay Colony. The villagers kept their oath. Abigail Rudd's afflictions ceased within a week. Widow Doiver recovered from her cough by the new year. Little Mercy Lincombe grew up, married a cooper from Haverhill, and lived into her 80s without ever, according to her descendants, speaking a single word about the events of that November. The orchard continued to produce cider, though later generations noted that after 1692, the cider tasted different. Some said sweeter. Some said bitter at the back of the tongue. The meeting house continued to hold Sunday services under a new minister sent from Cambridge, a young man named Reverend Jonathan Faldworth, who was told nothing of what had happened and who preached for 32 years without ever suspecting that he was preaching from a pulpit set over an iron box set over the confession that had killed 3 men. The iron box remained locked for 92 years. In 1784, the old meeting house was declared structurally unsound. A new federal-style church had been built on the hill above, and the congregation decided to abandon the old oak and stone structure that had stood for 123 years. The country was no longer a British colony. It had just emerged from a long war. The new minister, a young Yale-trained man named Reverend Josiah Trowbridge, oversaw the demolition. Trowbridge was 29 years old and had never heard the story of the night discourse. The villagers of his time, the great-grandchildren of those who had sat in the meeting house that November, no longer told the story even to their own families. It had slipped into the category of half-remembered, and from there into not quite believed, and from there into something indistinguishable from forgetting. During the removal of the pulpit, a workman's pick struck something metal beneath the floorboards. The iron box was uncovered. Caleb Marwell had died nearly 40 years earlier, and the key had been lost. Trowbridge had the box pried open with a crowbar. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, was the manuscript of the Night Discourse. Trowbridge read it over 3 days. He was a man of the Enlightenment, a reader of Locke and Priestley, and he did not believe in devils or judgments from buried medicine men. But he believed in the dignity of the historical record, and he refused to destroy the document. Instead, he made a single handwritten copy, which he sent to Harvard College in the autumn of 1784, and he reburied the original with the demolished foundations of the meeting house. He told no one in the village. His cover letter to Harvard described the sermon as a remarkable document of the Puritan mind in a moment of moral crisis, and made no reference to any deaths. Harvard received it, filed it, and forgot it. The Harvard copy sat uncatalogued and essentially unread for most of the 19th century. It was rediscovered in 1887 by a young graduate student named Hollis Amberlin, who was researching the history of Puritan preaching for his doctoral dissertation. Amberlin was 24 years old, the son of a Unitarian minister from Worcester, and a careful, scrupulous researcher. He read the sermon, then read it again. He began to investigate the village of Wrentham Crossing, which by that date no longer existed under that name, having been absorbed into the town of Groveland in the early 1800s, the old meeting house site covered by a dairy pasture. Amberlin went to Groveland in the summer of 1888. He spent 3 weeks there, interviewing the oldest residents. He found 3 elderly women who had heard from their grandmothers fragments of a story about a bad sermon, and 3 men who had died in a single night long ago. One of them told him her grandmother had been kept home from that service because her mother had a bad feeling about it, and remembered hearing people running in the road late in the evening, and her mother standing at the window in the dark without lighting a candle. Amberlin found in the records of the First Parish of Groveland a single line for November 12, 1692, listing the burials of Silas Rudd, Thomas Penhale, and Ebenezer Cattrick on the same date. He found in the Essex County probate records the wills of all 3 men probated within a week of each other, with identical handwriting in the certifying notations, suggesting a single clerk had hurried through all 3 documents in one sitting. He found in a farmhouse attic a small fragment of what he believed to be Harkwell's private journal, including the passage describing the figure in the woods, preserved by accident as a stiffener in the spine of a homemade ledger. And he found, in a distant corner of the same dairy pasture, a low mound of stones that local farmers had never plowed around, because every draft horse they had ever tried to bring to that spot had balked and refused. Amberlin wrote up his findings in a monograph titled A Forgotten Sermon of the Salem Season and submitted it for publication in 1889. The monograph was rejected. The editor wrote privately that the subject matter was not suitable for a serious scholarly journal and would only encourage superstitious speculation. Amberlin put the monograph in a drawer. He finished his dissertation on a safer topic, took a teaching position at a small college in central Pennsylvania, and died of tuberculosis in 1893 at the age of 29. His papers, including the unpublished monograph, were donated to the Essex Historical Society, placed in a wooden filing cabinet, and remained uncatalogued for another 60 years. The story was rediscovered a 3rd time in the autumn of 1953. A local historian in Groveland, a retired schoolteacher named Edna Corwick, 68 years old, unmarried, methodical, with a file cabinet of her own and a system of colored index cards, found the Amberlin papers at the Historical Society, read the monograph, and grew interested in the site of the old meeting house. She obtained permission from the family that owned the former dairy pasture to survey the land. In October of that year, she hired a local man with a metal detector, a veteran of the Korean War named Tim Overbeck, to sweep the area. Within an hour, they had located what appeared to be the iron corner braces of the old meeting house foundation. In November, working alone on a cold, overcast afternoon, she returned to the site with a garden trowel and a small canvas bag. She dug by hand at the spot where the detector had registered most strongly. About 18 inches below the surface, she found the broken remains of the iron box. Most of the original manuscript had rotted away. 169 years in New England soil had reduced nearly all the pages to illegibility. But a single folded sheet, preserved by the waxed cloth that had once lined the box, had survived. Written on it, in Reverend Harkwell's hand, was the list of 7 names. Miss Corwick took the list home. She placed it between 2 sheets of blotting paper, inside a manila folder, inside a drawer of her desk. She showed it to no one. She did not mention it in her book on the history of Groveland, published in 1955. She did, however, write about it in a private diary. The entries describe a gradual change in her daily life over the 3 months following the excavation. She began to sleep poorly. The house felt symmetrical, as though one corner was slightly heavier than the others. On the night of February 14, 1954, she dreamed of a tall man in a gray coat standing at the foot of her bed, not pointing at her, but simply looking at her. And in the dream, she understood that he was not angry, but merely waiting to see what she would do. She decided that morning to make no further inquiries. She would neither publish the list nor destroy it. She would simply let it sit in her desk. The dream stopped shortly afterward. She died in 1961 of heart failure in her sleep. She left her papers to the Essex Historical Society, where the list was catalogued. Then, through bureaucratic oversight, misfiled in a folder labeled 1890s Correspondence. It remained there unread until 2008. In 2008, a young archivist named David Thorogood Vlachos, 27 years old, with a master's degree in archival science from Simmons College, working on a temporary contract, opened the misfiled folder as part of a digital cataloging project. He saw the list immediately. Miss Corwick's careful handwriting of 1953 stood out against the older hand of the 17th century paper beneath it. He knew at once that something had been filed in the wrong century. He did not write a sensational article. He did not send the list to a journal. But he noted the names, and he began quietly on his own time to investigate what had happened to the 7 people on the list. He worked on this investigation for 6 years, entirely outside his official duties, using Sundays and long holiday weekends. He became an uncredentialed but meticulous genealogist of the old Essex County families. He learned to read the handwriting of a dozen different parish clerks. He read microfilmed probate records until his eyes blurred. He traveled to small historical societies in Vermont and Maine on his own money. In 2014, he shared his findings in a single private lecture at the Historical Society, attended by only 7 people. The lecture was not recorded, but a 2-page summary exists in the Society's internal records. His findings were these: Abigail Rudd lived until 1731. She never had children. She spent most of her adult life in what her contemporaries called a state of persistent melancholy. She was buried in an unmarked grave at her own request. Her will contained a cryptic instruction that nothing of hers should ever be interred in the ground of Wrentham Crossing, meaning the old village, already disappearing into Groveland. Prudence Doiver died in 1709. Her will left her entire estate, a very small one, to the child Mercy Lincombe, with an instruction that Mercy was to plant no apple trees on any property she owned for the rest of her life. Mercy obeyed this instruction for the next 74 years. Her descendants continued to obey it for another 3 generations. According to a family memoir written in 1847 by a great-great-granddaughter who did not know why the prohibition existed, but had been told by her mother that it was not to be broken, Reverend Josiah Harkwell disappeared into the woods north of the village. But Vlachos found, in a collection of late colonial French missionary correspondence held at the Archives Nationales in Paris, a letter from 1696 written by a Jesuit priest working among the Abenaki in what is now southern Quebec. The priest, Father Etienne Baudoin, described meeting an elderly English minister who had been living for nearly 4 years as a guest of a Pennacook band that had fled northward. The minister spoke tolerable French, good Latin, and was learning the Algonquian of the band with a patience the priest found admirable. The minister told him a story about a debt, a list of 7 names, a sermon that killed 3 men, and a calling to spend the remainder of his life among the descendants of those his own people had killed, until such time as his own dead should also be considered paid. The priest noted that the minister was in excellent health and appeared to be at peace. No record of Harkwell's death has ever been found. His name simply ceases to appear in the fragmentary correspondence of the northern missions around 1710 or 1712. And the first 3 names on the list, Silas Rudd, Thomas Penhale, Ebenezer Kotrick, had of course all died on the night of the sermon. But Vlachos, examining the list more carefully under magnification, noticed something that all previous readers had missed. The first 3 names appeared to have been written in a slightly different ink from the 4th name, Harkwell's own, and the 5th, 6th, and 7th names, which had always been assumed to be blank, were not blank at all. They had been written in a 3rd kind of ink, much fainter, invisible under ordinary light, and had survived only because the waxed cloth had protected the page from bleaching. Under ultraviolet examination, Vlachos was able to read the 3 remaining names Jonas Rudd, Obadiah Penhale, Hezekiah Kotrick, the 3 men who had killed the Pennacook in 1663, whose descendants had died on the night of the sermon. The list was not a record of those who would die. It was a record of a ledger being closed. 7 names, 3 who had killed, 3 who would confess, and in the middle, Harkwell's own name, the one who would carry the accounting from one side of the ledger to the other. Vlachos ended his lecture with a final photograph he had taken the previous summer at the site of the old meeting house. The mound of stones was still there. He had not disturbed it, only taken a photograph. But when he developed the photograph, he noticed that at the edge of the mound, partially covered by moss, there was a flat stone. Cut into its surface in shallow, weathered lines were 7 marks arranged in a horizontal row, 3 on the left, 1 slightly larger in the center, 3 on the right. He did not know when the marks had been cut. He did not know who had cut them. He said only that the story, as far as he could follow it, had ended, and that the ledger, as far as he could tell, had been closed. But there is one final detail. In the spring of 2016, a real estate developer named Morgan Calvett purchased the former dairy pasture with plans to build a small subdivision. The survey for the development noted the mound of stones and marked it for removal. Before the removal could be carried out, 3 of the workers on the project became seriously ill within 11 days. 2 cases of severe pneumonia, 1 previously undiagnosed heart condition in a man of 43. The project was not delayed because of the illnesses. It was delayed because the developer, according to local reporting, simply changed his mind. He sold the land to the town of Groveland as a small conservation parcel. When a local reporter asked why he had reversed his decision, Calvet said that he had walked the property one afternoon in late May, alone, and had stood for a while near the stone mound. He did not know what had happened to him there. He said only that he had felt, in his own words, like a man standing in a room that had been waiting a long time to be left alone. He retired from real estate development the following year. The mound was not disturbed. The marks on the flat stone are still there. What do you think of this story? This response is AI, generated and for reference purposes only.